Hey, A-Pushers. So, today's lecture is actually going to um, be fascinating. There is a monumental shift that takes place in the 1970s domestically. I know we've been stuck in foreign policy for a while, but something interesting happens in the 1970s. And we're going to see a major shift taking place, especially in the economy. We'll see that we're going to emerge from World War II strong economically, and that we see the rise of the middle class. We know this. And this is going to persist in the 1950s and 60s, an economic boom, essentially pulling Americans into the middle class, the majority of Americans into the middle class. But then we're going to start to see a shift in, I guess, progress. We saw this economic progress in the 1950s and 60s, and that's really going to stop by the 1970s, and I would argue never really recovered. Um, and as a result, we see a widening of the income gap that has been happening since the 1970s. So the big question is why? Why did that happen? Um, in hopes that hopefully in the future we can change this. Uh, so today that's what we're going to be talking about. Our main topic is going to be the economy of the 1970s, a term, and you're going to see reference to a lot of the stuff we talk about today in a lot of modern political discussion, a lot of economic discussion in among intellectuals and pundits. You're going to hear a lot of reference to these things that we're going to be talking about today. So today's a really important lesson. So, the economy of the 1970s is referred to as stagflation. It's a compound word. It's stagnation plus inflation. And this was a phenomenon that had never happened before. Now, granted, remember that as a result of our shift from an agriculturally based society to an industrial society, the rules of the economy changed. And and as a result, everybody was proposing different ways of dealing with the economy because it was a brand new economy. Well, we're going to see another shift now. We're going to start moving away from being a manufacturing or industrial based economy to something else. And as a result, we're going to see politicians and economists, the Federal Reserve, struggling to figure out how to deal with this second new economy. All right, so stagflation. So stagflation is a combination of a few things. Rising prices, so inflation. Okay, so rising prices is inflation. It also has to do with growth. We're going to start to see a stagnating growth rate, right? And it also has to do with unemployment. We're going to see unemployment rise. Okay, so um, that's what stagflation is, a combination of rising prices, a stagnating economy, and unemployment. So, what was the cause of all of this? Um, it's complicated, and I'm going to simplify it as best I can. But there are a number of factors that are going to be at play here. But first, let's just delve into the whole stagflation. So there's no productivity gains over the entire decade, which means no productivity. Our industry isn't producing, right? As a matter of fact, our imports, we imported more than we exported. Now, in an industrialized, productive economy, we export, 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 right? But in the 1970s, we see a reversal. We are importing more than we are exporting, so there's a trade deficit, right? So our economy is stagnating. Our industrialized economy is stagnating. And economists didn't necessarily know this at the time, but it's because we were shifting. We were shifting away from a majority industrial based economy. We're also seeing growing inflation, and that means raising prices. All right, we're also going to see unemployment also rise. So all of these combining factors makes up what is known as stagflation. All right, so let's look at the chart. This is the unemployment rate, and as you can see, um, unemployment, of course, was pretty high here because of the Great Depression. All right, but then World War II happens, and pretty much no one's unemployed. But then we start to see a steady increase, right, in unemployment. All right, so and we're going to be in this time period right here, right from here to here. This is the time period under Nixon, and as we can see, growing unemployment. All right, so let's go into why. What is that? That should not be there. So forget that. All right. Oops, wrong way. Okay, so what is one of the reasons for high prices? Okay, it dates back to what is known as the Arab oil embargo. You may have heard reference to this. And I'm dyslexic. It's 1973, not 37, and 1978. So 73. The first major one was in 1973, and that was directly as a result of the Yom Kippur War that we talked about last video. So, because the United States supported Israel in the Yom Kippur War, the Arab nations decided to seek revenge against the United States, and they placed an oil embargo. OPEC, right, the Arab producing nations, the Arab oil producing nations, they placed an embargo against the United States in retaliation for U.S. support in Israel. And here's the thing, when oil prices are high, that means prices for everything become high. Because think about it, in order for factories to manufacture, they need oil and gas. In order to transport their product from the factory to distributors, and then from distributors to retailers, they need oil and gas. In order to turn the electricity on, right, um, to run the factories, you need oil and gas. So because everything became more expensive, prices begin to rise. Now, that's one reason. It's not the only reason, but that's one reason. So, inflation, right, was largely due to high oil prices. All right, and so that is a contributing factor. Now, I'm just going to back up a little bit, and I've already explained this, but here it is written down. Remember, post-war boom of the 1950s and 60s, productivity increased because we were the only country in the world, because of World War II, the devastation of World War II, who was able to produce. And so the eyes of the world turned to the United States to get their stuff, right? And U.S. workers doubled their standard of living as a result of that. The American dollar became really strong. We became a superpower, not only in terms of a Cold War power, but an economic giant, right? Um, and a lot of the reason for the strong dollar was, yes, everyone turned to us, but then that's not sustainable. There's going to be a recovery um, by other countries, including Europe. There's going to be a recovery, and so the productions is going to be more distributed around the world, so everybody won't completely rely on the U.S. But the economy remained strong largely because of U.S. government spending, and this was because of Cold War spending, including Vietnam, including um, the uh, the the war on poverty, right? The Great Society. So because of U.S. spending, government spending, it continued to strengthen the dollar. But of course, none of this is sustainable, right? None of this is sustainable, and so it took an epic dive in the 1970s. And as you can see, even though the economy stagnated, prices continued to remain high, which had never been seen before. Usually, when the economy slows down, prices drop. But that's not what happened here because of the Arab oil embargo, right? Yeah, the economy started to slow down, but prices remained really high. Okay, another source of stagflation, and I hinted at this, but let's just flush this out. It's globalization. So remember, after World War II, we were the only ones left that had any major industrial capacity. But within 5 to 10 years, of course, with U.S. help, ironically, the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Europe, rebuilding Germany, rebuilding Japan, rebuilding the Middle East, they, of course, invested in industry. And so foreign competition started to eke into U.S. U.S. production. And it turned out they built Germany, Japan, they built stronger, better, faster factories, as opposed to US factories that were kind of outmoded and out of date because they were 20, 30, 40, 50 years old by now, right? So the production coming out of Germany and Japan are going to be at a higher quality because they invested in modernization, where the US became kind of lazy with regard to that. The biggest example is in the car industry. So in the 1940s and 50s, the automobile, right, the American icon, the automobile, was largely just produced by Americans. We had the biggest manufacturing producer in the world. But then Germany and Japan decided that they were going to invest also in automobile manufacturing. And by the 1970s, they're outperforming US cars. They're better priced, more reliable, all of that. So in the 1970s, we're going to start to see automobile, that's the example I'm going to use, but also in steel, also in consumer electronics, right? That Germany and Japan are going to outmode us. And so they eke in on U.S. competition, and this is going to lead to a stagnating U.S. economy. So we're not going to be the industrial giants that we used to be. A third reason was logistics. So containerization, believe it or not, was another source of stagflation, of globalization. What do I mean by that? Well, there was a new technology in shipping, because in order to get products, you have to ship products around the world, right? And so it went from the factories to the ports onto ships, right, and then to their destinations. Well, in the 1950s, we started to see modernization techniques in containerization of products to be shipped. It used to be that all the products were moved to the docks, and then they were all containered up and loaded up onto the ships. But a change took place. Largely started by a guy named what was his name, McLean, Malcolm McLean, and he developed this idea of in the factory going ahead and containerizing the product right there in the factory. So you package it all up right there in the factory in these big, huge containers. And then you brought the containers self sustained to the dock, and then cranes would lift the containers already packaged up onto the ship. And then once the ship sailed off, took off, and unloaded at a dock at their destination, the container was returned back to the factory. And that saved on shipping. That saved monumentally on how much it cost to move product. So it made outsourcing possible. So it didn't matter where anything was produced anymore because moving it was cheap. So instead of factories being based in the United States where workers were paid well, let's go to Germany, Japan, the Middle East, let's go to Mexico, let's go to different parts of the world, Southeast Asia, where labor is cheap. And it doesn't matter if it's going twice the distance because shipping is now cheap. So it made outsourcing more possible. And companies said, yeah, because I'll profit more if I'm able to pay workers in factories less money. So what we see developing in the United States is called the Rust Belt, where factories are closing down, jobs are being lost. So that brings us to our third component of the 1970s stagflation, high unemployment. People started losing their factory jobs because they were getting outsourced, right? So unemployment was at a high, prices for product was at a high, the economy is shifting away from industry. All right, and then an interesting thing. Now, how does Nixon react to dealing with this new economic policy? Well, here's the problem, because it's never happened before. Anything that, in order to deal with inflation, you would put policies in effect that essentially would make unemployment worse, right? But if you dealt with unemployment issues to help unemployment reach employment, that actually had a negative effect on inflation. So the fixes hurt the other problem. So for inflation to deal with, you usually deal with inflation according to Keynesian economics, to deal with inflation by reducing consumer purchasing power. So you to make prices go down, essentially people need to not have enough money to purchase, right? Reduce consumer purchasing power. How can the government do that? Well, they would increase taxation. They could tighten credit, tighten monetary, so don't print as much money. Tighten it all up, make it more rare, and therefore it makes the value of the dollar higher, and that way you don't have to spend as many dollars, right, to buy something. So the prices go down. All right, but any those things that I just said, like increasing taxes, tightening monetary policies, all of that made unemployment worse. So we were in a catch 22. So what was Nixon going to do? Nixon decided, okay, well, he increased the federal budget deficit, so he started continuing to spend by the US government, spend, spend, spend. He also devalued the dollar by flooding the market with currencies. Let's just put a lot of currency in circulation, but that did devalue the dollar. And it was an attempt to stimulate the economy, to make Americans' goods more competitive overseas, right? So if we to lower the price so that it's more competitive overseas. So he tried these policies, but I will tell you, at the end of the day, stagnation persisted throughout Nixon's administration, his two administrations, 2 3/4 administrations. So he will not solve this problem. All right, so let's move away from the economy, and I'll pick this story back up when we get to Ford and Carter, right? So that's the second half of the 1970s. All right, so let's move to more domestic policy away from the economy. So his domestic policy was known as New Federalism, a new type of federalism. And to Nixon, as a conservative, he believed power should reside in the states. So New Federalism is, let's move away from what Democratic presidents had done in the past, i.e., LBJ, Truman, and FDR, right? Moving back in time. Let's not have big national government. Instead, let's shift power back to the states. So a new federalism. Remember, federalism is a division of power between the national state and local governments. All right, so conservatives believe that the national government should play a smaller role in people's lives. So power back to the states. One way that he would do this is known, and this was his policy, revenue sharing. So revenue is money generated by the government, and let's share it, meaning let's take money collected by the federal government and return some of it to state and local governments, so that state and local governments were in a better position to spend that money because they know where their constituents need the money. So it makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense, right? But there's some problems with it, as we'll see in a second. Here's one of those problems. So we're shifting money. So let's leave it up to the states. But here's the deal. Remember the Civil Rights Movement and the KKK and all of those problems associated with desegregation. And if you leave it up to the states are going to not do things they probably should do. So, and Nixon was fine with it because, to be honest, remember, by the 1970s, schools, despite Brown versus Board, schools in the South, right, did not really integrate. Yeah, we had the Little Rock Nine, and we had, but those were little stories here and there, and they weren't even successful, right? Because essentially what had happened was that whites, European Americans, I don't know how else to call them, they left the city. They said, I'm not sending my kids to schools with African American children. So they left the cities, went to the suburbs. And we knew suburbanization was a big movement in the 1950s and 60s anyway. So we essentially had segregation, right, by geography. And even in cities, there was still segregation. And so this was a pervasive problem throughout the Nixon administration, but he didn't want to deal with it. He wanted to touch it with a 10-foot pole because um, it was a highly charged issue. So he kind of bowed out of it by saying, let the states handle this. It's not a federal government, it's not a national government job to deal with this. It should go to local control, right? It was known as his Southern strategy. And this was how to get what was traditionally Democratic South to support him in the 1968 and 72 elections. How do we get those Democrats who weren't the hippies, right? Nixon's never going to attract those types, those more liberal Democrats, but he could get those conservative Democrats, those Southern Democrats who were racist, right? Who still held on to lost cause theories, who still believed in segregation. How do we attract? Because they have traditional conservative beliefs, meaning traditional beliefs. Traditional referring to the tradition of the lost cause, the tradition of, let African Americans need to know their place, that whole thing, that traditionalism, Democrats in the South held on to. And so his Southern strategy was to say, oh, let the states handle it. And this is going to pull a lot of Southern Democrats to vote for Nixon in both of his elections. So it was known as, he also referred, and this is another campaign strategy that helped in women 68 and 72, the silent majority. You're going to hear reference to all this. The Southern strategy, the silent majority, y'all will hear reference to this. This is like major stuff. So the silent majority, who were they? Quote, the great majority of Americans, the forgotten Americans, the non-shouters, the non-demonstrators. It's Joe and Rosie, right? Joe and Rosie, who weren't out there, championing civil rights. Joe and Rosie were not out there, trying to get women's rights. Joe and Rosie were not out there trying to protect Native American rights or gay rights or anything, right? They're the silent majority, but they're a majority. And Nixon kind of knew it. And so he appealed to them. Part of the silent majority, was a Southern strategy. He basically tried to appeal to middle class whites who were angered by the civil rights movement, angered by Vietnam War protests. And he tapped into that anger, and something that in recent years Trump has done, appealing to that angry white voter. And it turned out to be a successful strategy. All right, so he wins both in 68 and 72, despite the fact that Watergate had already broken by the 1972 election. Okay, so let me also remind you that much like every president before Nixon, he was a moderate. Yes, he was a conservative, and yes, FDR was a more of a liberal. We know that presidents lean left or lean right, but until modern times, until the polarization that we saw happening in the 2000s, every president always moved to the middle. And so let's look and see both conservative as well as liberal policies that were enacted by the Nixon administration. Because I would argue he was a moderate. Conservative moderate, but moderate nonetheless. All right, remember, he in office faced a Democratic majority in Congress, so he did have to keep his conservative policies in check. For example, he increased Social Security benefits and food stamp programs. He increased that. That's a more of a liberal policy, but that's what he did. He built more public housing. He passed the 26th Amendment to lower the voting age to 18. He established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. Belief in the environment and science. Again, this was a different Republican Party. He established the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA. Anytime you get any weather or hurricane information, it comes from NOAA. Everyone gets their information to this day from NOAA. He established the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. That's OSHA. So this is another major organization that was meant to protect workers, right? He even created a presidential task force on women's rights. So very liberal policies here. Again, because presidents were always pulled to the center. Okay, we're going to stop here because I've gone on, and we'll pick up with Next video, social justice, right? And yes, we'll start with 5 items. All right, guys, stay safe.